I am going to tell you something I have never said out loud. Not to my daughter, not to my doctor, not even to myself. Not in the way that counts, not in the way where the words actually leave your mouth and become real. I gave her everything, not everything I had left over, not the spare change at the bottom of a generous man's pocket. Everything. The kind of everything that takes 40 years to build and about 18 months to hand away with both hands, wide open, smiling like a man who finally found what he was looking for. I am 76 years old. I am a retired accountant from Michigan. I spent 4 decades managing other people's money, and I never once lost a dollar that wasn't mine to lose. I never made a bad bet. I never got emotional about numbers. Numbers were the one place in my life where everything made sense, where everything balanced, where there was always a right answer if you looked carefully enough. And then I went to the Philippines, and I met a woman named Stephanie, and I stopped looking carefully at anything. The final number is $445,000. I have done the math more times than I can count, sitting at my kitchen table in Michigan at 2 a.m, running the figures the way I used to run client audits, line by line, category by category, hoping that somewhere in the spreadsheet there is a mistake I missed. There is no mistake. The number is $445,000, and the only mistake was me. My daughter Carol was the one who said I should travel. She sat across from me at Thanksgiving dinner in 2020, and she looked at me the way people had been looking at me for 5 years, that careful, worried look, the one that said she was afraid I was disappearing. And she said, "When is the last time you did something for yourself?" I told her I had gone to the hardware store that week. She did not laugh. She said, "I mean something that matters, something that reminds you that you are still here." I did not know how to answer that, because the honest answer was that I had not felt like I was still here for a very long time. Ellen died in 2015, ovarian cancer. We had 44 years together, and I thought I knew what grief was going to feel like. I thought I had watched enough people lose enough things to understand the shape of it. I was wrong. The grief was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was just silence, a particular kind of silence that moves into every room of a house and never leaves. I kept going, the way men like me keep going. I maintained the property. I filed my taxes. I attended church on Sundays and sat in the same pew Ellen and I had shared for 30 years. I ate alone. I slept on my side of the bed. I watched the news. I told people I was fine, and most of them believed me because I said it in a tone of voice that did not invite argument. By 2021, Carol was not the only one who was worried. My son David, who lives in Seattle and calls once a month with the efficiency of a man fulfilling an obligation, had started adding an extra pause at the end of our conversations, a pause that meant he was trying to decide whether to say something real. He never did. Carol was the one who found the neighbor's recommendation, the man down the street who had been to the Philippines the year before and came back talking about how warm it was, how affordable, how the people there made you feel like you belonged somewhere. Carol printed out the information and left it on my kitchen table without saying anything, which was her way of saying everything without starting an argument. I booked the flight in September 2021. I told myself I was going for 2 weeks. I packed one carry-on bag and a folder with my travel insurance documents, and I flew to Manila and then took a connecting flight to Clark, which is the airport that serves Angeles City, Pampanga. I had done the research. Angeles City is one of those places that has a reputation, the kind of reputation that appears in the second paragraph of any article about expat life in Southeast Asia. It is known for its nightlife. It is known for the kind of easy, uncomplicated companionship that draws Western men who are tired of complicated lives. I told myself I was not that kind of man. I told myself I was going for the sunshine and the low cost of living and the change of scenery. I told myself a lot of things on that flight. The city hit me the moment I stepped outside the terminal. The heat was immediate and physical, like walking into a room where someone had left the oven on for a week. The noise was constant, motorbikes and jeepneys and music from speakers mounted outside every third storefront. Everything moved fast and bright and slightly sideways from what I was used to. I was 75 years old. I had not been outside North America since a business trip to Toronto in 1994. I stood on the curb with my carry-on bag and I felt about as visible as a stop sign, and for one ridiculous moment I thought about getting back on the plane. I checked into a hotel near the main strip, a clean, mid-range place with air conditioning that worked and a breakfast buffet that started at 7. On my third morning, I was sitting at the buffet with a plate of eggs and a cup of coffee, so strong it tasted like it had opinions, and a man sat down across from me without asking permission and said, "You got the look." I looked up. He was maybe 68, wide-shouldered, with the kind of tan that comes from years rather than vacations. He had a Texas drawl and a coffee mug with a chip in the handle that he had clearly brought from his room. His name was Buck Caldwell. He had been living in Angeles City for 4 years, retired from a career in commercial construction, divorced twice, entirely at peace with both facts. The look, he explained, was the expression every first-time visitor wore on day 3, which was when the novelty had faded enough to let the disorientation in but not long enough for the place to start making sense. He told me it wore off. He told me he would show me the parts of the city that were not printed in the guidebooks. Buck spent the next 3 days giving me a different Angeles City than the one I had been half afraid of. He showed me a coffee shop run by a retired school teacher who made the best calamansi juice I had ever tasted. He showed me the park by the river where old men played chess in the morning shade. He showed me how to navigate the market without getting overcharged, how to find the restaurants that the expats trusted, how to read the particular social geometry of a city built around a very specific kind of transaction without letting that geometry define everything you experience there. A lot of people come here for the wrong reasons. Buck told me, over cold San Miguel at a sidewalk bar on our third afternoon, and some of them stay for the right ones. Depends on what you let the city be to you. I thought I understood what he was saying. I did not yet understand it well enough. On my 6th evening, Buck said there was a karaoke bar he liked. Not the dark and heavy kind, but a well-lit lounge with good music and a manager who kept things decent. We took a tricycle and arrived at a place called Carmelo's. White walls and wooden tables and a stage where a man in his 50s was singing a Sinatra song with the specific kind of emotion that only comes from a man who has earned it. The house manager appeared when we sat down, checking that the table was clean, asking what we wanted to drink with the calm efficiency of someone who had been running rooms like this for years. She was in her early 40s, I guessed. She wore her hair pulled back. She had a way of moving through a room that said she owned every inch of it without needing to raise her voice. She looked at me with clear, direct eyes and said the words that I would think about for weeks afterward. "You look tired," she said. "Not drunk tired, life tired. That kind I understand." I did not have a good answer for that. I just nodded. And she moved on to the next table, and I sat there with my beer and my silence and thought, I cannot remember the last time someone looked at me long enough to notice. Her name was Stephanie Campos. She was the manager of Carmelo's. And that was the beginning of everything. I went back to Carmelo's 3 more times in the next 2 weeks, and every time I told myself it was because I liked the music. The Sinatra Man was there on Thursdays. There was a woman who sang Tagalog ballads on Saturdays with a voice that could have filled a concert hall and chose instead to fill a karaoke lounge in Angeles City, which seemed like either a tragedy or a choice I did not have enough information to judge. But the honest truth, the truth I was not yet saying out loud, was that I went back because of Stephanie. She made time for me, not in the way that felt calculated, not in the way I had been warned about. The careful performance of attention that some men describe when they talk about this city. It felt natural. On my second visit, she brought her coffee to my table during her break and sat across from me and said, "You came back." I said I liked the music. She smiled in a way that suggested she heard what I was not saying. "What did you do?" she asked. "Before you came here. What was your life?" I told her I was a retired accountant. She said, "Numbers." I said, "Yes, numbers." She said, "And people's problems, probably. That is what accountants really do. They hold other people's problems in order." I said that was a generous way to describe it. She said she was a generous person. I believed her. She told me about her life in pieces, the way people tell you things when they are deciding how much to trust you. She told me about her 3 children first. Yvette was 13, a serious girl who wanted to be a doctor. The boys, Angelo and Marco, were 10 and 8, loud and sweet and exhausting in the way that small boys are exhausting. She told me about their father, her ex-husband, with the careful, neutral tone of someone who has made peace with a painful thing but has not forgotten it. He drank, she said. Not all the time, but when he did, the house changed. You know how some people are different when they drink? Like a door opens and something else comes out? He was like that. She paused. He left when Marco was 2. I have not heard from him in 6 years. She said all of this without self-pity, as a statement of fact, the way you describe a scar on your arm. It happened. Here is the shape of it. I have kept going. I told her about Ellen on my 3rd visit. I had not talked about Ellen to anyone in a long time. Not really. Not beyond the standard answers I gave people who asked the "I am managing, thank you." It has been a few years now. Answers that closed conversations down before they could go anywhere real. But something about Stephanie's manner, the way she listened without preparing her response while I was still talking, made me say more than I intended. I told her that Ellen and I met when I was 28 and she was 26, and we argued about the restaurant bill on our first date because she insisted on splitting it and I insisted on paying, and we compromised by each paying for half of each other's meal, which made no mathematical sense but made us both laugh. I told her we had 2 children and a house in Michigan with a maple tree in the front yard that Ellen planted the year we moved in, and that tree is still there, taller than the house now. I need to explain something about how I was living before I went to the Philippines, because without that explanation, none of what happened makes sense. I do not mean the logistics. The logistics were straightforward. A retired man with a paid-off house and a pension and money in the bank, and no one to spend any of it on. I mean the interior life, the part that does not show up in any financial statement. For 6 years after Ellen died, I had been operating on what I can only describe as autopilot of the spirit. I got up each morning because I got up each morning. I ate because the body requires fuel. I saw people because isolation has visible consequences that I did not want to explain to my doctor. But I was not, in any real sense, living. I was performing the administrative functions of a life without any of the underlying meaning that makes those functions worthwhile. I knew this. And then I sat in a karaoke lounge in Angeles City, and a woman looked at me for 10 seconds and said something true about what she saw, and the lights inside me flickered. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. 6 years is a long time to be alone, she said. Not alone like there is no one around you. Alone like the one person who understood the inside of you is gone. I nodded. My throat was doing the thing it did when I was trying not to feel something in public. She did not try to comfort me. She did not say it gets easier, or she is in a better place, or any of the other things people say when they want to fill the space where grief lives. She just sat with it. She let it be there. And that, more than anything else she did in those early weeks, was what got me. By the end of the 2nd week, she was texting me in the mornings. Nothing heavy, just small things. A photo of the coffee shop near her house. A message saying she hoped I slept well. A question about what I had eaten for breakfast. The kind of question that means nothing by itself but means everything as a pattern, as evidence that someone is thinking about you when you are not in the room. I answered every message. I answered them quickly, which for a man who had been described by his own daughter as emotionally unavailable for the better part of 5 years was, I understood even then, a significant data point. One evening she asked me, while we were sitting at my usual table and the Sinatra man was between songs, "Do you ever talk to her, your wife?" I said I did not believe in that kind of thing. She tilted her head. "Maybe that is why it still hurts," she said, "because you have not given yourself somewhere to put it." I looked at her. I did not have a good answer. She picked up her coffee and went back to work, and I sat there and thought about that for a long time. And when I got back to the hotel, I sat on the edge of the bed and I said out loud, into the empty air of the room, "Ellen, I think I am in trouble." That was the first honest thing I had said in years, and the silence that came back was different from the silence I had been living in. It was warmer. It was something. I told myself it was grief releasing. I did not examine the other possibilities. Not yet. My original return flight was booked for the first week of November 2021. I pushed it back twice. The second time, I did not reschedule it at all. I called the property management company in Michigan and told them to handle anything that came up. I told Carol I was staying a little longer because the weather was good and I was feeling better than I had in years, both of which were true, and neither of which was the whole truth. Stephanie had started spending evenings at my hotel. Not every evening at first, but often enough that the hotel staff knew her name and stopped giving me the particular look that hotel staff in Angeles City have learned to give older Western men with younger female visitors. She brought food sometimes, containers from a restaurant near her apartment, dishes with names I could not pronounce that tasted better than anything I had eaten in years. She organized my hotel room without being asked, moving things from where I had left them to where they made sense, stacking my reading glasses next to my book, putting my shoes in the closet instead of beside the door. I noticed. I did not say anything. The noticing was enough. After 3 weeks of this, she suggested, gently, that the hotel suite with the small kitchen might be more comfortable than the standard room I was in. She had seen it when she visited a friend once. It had a proper table, a real kitchen, more light. I upgraded the next morning. She brought a small coffee maker from her apartment 2 days later. "You should not be drinking hotel coffee," she said. "It tastes like regret." I laughed. I had not laughed like that in 5 years. She started calling the suite our place, a small word, our, dropped into sentences so naturally that I did not notice it had happened until it already had. And I did not correct her. That is the thing I need to say clearly. I did not correct her. I wanted the word there. She brought her children on a Sunday afternoon, about a month into things. Yvette shook my hand with the firm grip of a girl who had been told that handshakes mattered and who had decided to take that advice seriously. She looked at me with her mother's directness and said, "My mother says you are from Michigan. Is it true that it gets to 40 below in winter?" I said that was an exaggeration. She said she would look it up. The boys, Angelo and Marco, were too busy eating everything on the table to have an opinion about me. I gave each of them an envelope with some cash at the end of the afternoon, and the look on Stephanie's face when I did it was worth more to me than I want to admit. She looked at me like I was exactly the kind of man she had stopped believing existed. That evening, after the children had gone, I told Stephanie I wanted to help with the household. I told her I would set up a monthly arrangement, a set amount that would cover rent and groceries and school costs, something that took the pressure off so she could focus on her work without worrying. I told her it was a practical decision, not a grand gesture. I told myself the same thing. "You do not have to do this," she said. She said it quietly, looking at her tea, but she did not look at me when she said it. And she did not give the envelope back. There is something I want to say about generosity that I think gets misunderstood when people hear stories like this. The giving was not all manipulation. Not at first. In those early months, the giving felt genuinely good. I had money. She had need. I had spent 4 decades helping people organize their resources, and I had always believed that money was a tool, that its meaning came from what you used it for. The children were real. The school was real. Marilou's arthritic hands were real. When I gave money to those things, I was not a gullible old man being swindled. I was a man with resources making a choice. The fact that the choice was also convenient for someone who needed it to be convenient does not retroactively make the feeling false. It makes the whole thing sadder. It makes it human rather than simply cautionary, and human stories are the ones that cut deepest because you can see yourself in them. Buck took me for coffee the next morning. He knew without me telling him. He said, "You are moving fast, Kenneth." I told him I knew what I was doing. He wrapped both hands around his mug and nodded in that slow way of his, the nod that is not agreement but acknowledgement, the nod that says, "I hear you, and I have said my piece, and I am not going to say it again. At least not today." I respected him for that. I did not listen to him, but I respected him. I moved Stephanie and her children into a 2-bedroom condominium in month 2. The rent was $900 a month. I paid the deposit and the first 3 months up front. I told Stephanie it made more sense than the hotel suite, financially, which was true. I also told myself that having a real address, a place that was ours rather than mine, meant something permanent, something I had not felt since the maple tree in Michigan. I helped them move in on a Saturday. Marco found a gecko on the wall behind the refrigerator and named it Kenneth. I took that as a good sign. I was not sure what it was a sign of, exactly, but it felt like belonging, and belonging after 6 years of that Michigan silence felt like air. Months 4 through 7, and the circle of need got wider. I want to be careful about how I say this, because the way I am tempted to say it now makes it sound like a trap that was set for me deliberately, and that is not quite right. It was more like a tide. You walk into the water meaning to go ankle deep, and then the ground slopes and you realize the water is at your waist and you do not remember when that happened. The school fees came first. Yvette had been accepted to a private school in San Fernando, a better school than the public one she was attending, with smaller classes and a science laboratory, and the kind of teachers who called parents when a student was exceptional rather than only when they were struggling. Stephanie mentioned it over dinner one evening in month 4, not as a request, more as a fact she was sad about. She got in, she said. I am proud of her, but the fees are more than I can manage. She said it looking at her plate, not at me. I asked how much. She told me. I told her I would handle it. She looked up. Kenneth, it is already decided, I said. Let her go to the good school. That was the last time Stephanie looked surprised when I offered money. Her mother, Marilou, was next. Stephanie drove me to San Fernando on a Sunday in month 5. The house was modest and orderly, a concrete structure with a garden that Marilou kept carefully, even with the arthritis that had been in her hands for years. Marilou shook my hand and called me Sir Kenneth, which made me feel about 100 years old, and she fed me rice and a fish dish that took 3 hours to make and tasted like it. I could see the medical bills on the table that Marilou had stacked neatly under a small statue of the Virgin Mary. I picked them up while Marilou was in the kitchen. The total was not small. I put the money in an envelope before we left. Marilou cried. I told her not to. She said, God bless you, Sir Kenneth, and I thought, standing in that small house in San Fernando, that I had not felt blessed in a very long time. The brothers appeared in month 6. Stephanie had 2, Arnell and Joey, both in their 30s, both living in the same general radius of San Fernando without any reliable occupation that I could identify. Stephanie referred to them as between things, which is a phrase that covers a great deal of ground when you do not look at it too carefully. Arnell came to the condo one afternoon and told Stephanie, in English because I was present and he was making sure I understood, that his motorbike needed repair, that he used the motorbike for work, that without it he could not work, that the repair was urgent. He said all of this to Stephanie, but he was looking at me. Stephanie looked at me too. I gave him $300. He said he would pay it back. He did not pay it back. A month later, Joey called with a different emergency, equally urgent, equally described in the presence of English, for my benefit. I gave him money too. I told myself these were one-time things. The tide was now at my shoulders. The thing about being an accountant for 40 years is that you develop a relationship with self-deception that is highly specific. You learn to see it in others instantly. You can smell it across a desk. You develop a professional contempt for it. And then you get home to your own life, and you become its most committed practitioner. Because the skills that make you good at detecting it in others make you extraordinarily good at constructing it for yourself. I knew what the salon money was going to be before Stephanie proposed it. I had told clients across 4 decades to walk away from investments with less obvious problems, and I sat at the kitchen table and I chose the story where I was the hero and the investment was sound. That is the specific kind of self-deception that nobody warns you about, not the kind where you are fooled, but the kind where you do the fooling yourself, carefully, knowing exactly what you are doing, because the alternative is admitting that the thing you need to believe is not true. In month 7, Stephanie came to me with the salon idea. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with that careful preparedness that people have when they have been rehearsing something, and she laid it out. A salon in a good location on a busy street in Angeles City, affordable lease, a market for it, a chance to build something that was actually hers, something she could be proud of, something that could eventually support the family without needing me. She said that last part looking directly at me. I understood what she was doing. She was framing the business as a path to independence. It worked on me the way it was designed to work. I said I would think about it. She brought me a paper with some figures on it that were optimistic in the way that first drafts always are. I looked at the paper carefully. I knew what I was looking at. I had spent 40 years looking at exactly this kind of document, and I knew the difference between a business plan and a wish written down. I wired the $55,000 6 days later. I gave her the money because she had cried a little when I said I would think about it, not dramatically, just one quiet tear that she brushed away quickly, and the sight of it had bypassed every professional instinct I had and gone straight to the place in me that wanted to be her hero. I knew it even as I wired the money. I knew exactly what I was doing and why, and I did it anyway. The salon opened in month 8, with a ceremony that Stephanie had been planning for weeks. Red ribbon across the door, a small table of food outside. Her friends from the bar, her cousins, Marilu with her careful hands and her proud smile. The sign above the door said Stephanie's in a script she had chosen herself. I stood at the ribbon cutting holding a pair of scissors too large for the task, and people took photographs, and Stephanie linked her arm through mine and looked at the camera and smiled, and I thought, this is what I came here for. I called Carol that evening. I told her about the salon. I described it as a friend's business that I had helped with, a local woman trying to build something. I used the word friend carefully. I had not told Carol the truth about Stephanie. I had not told her about the condo, or the school fees, or the monthly arrangement, or the $55,000. Carol said it sounded like I was really finding my place there, Dad, and I said I thought I was, and we talked about her kids for a while, and I hung up and stood at the window of the condo, looking at Angeles City at night, and I thought, at some point, I am going to have to tell her the whole story. I thought that, and then I closed the window and went to bed. Carol has never blamed me. I want to say that because it matters. After I eventually told her everything, she did not say I should have known better or she saw it coming. She said she was sorry it had hurt me. She said she was sorry I had been carrying it alone. She asked if I was eating properly and sleeping properly. The questions she asked because she is her mother's daughter, because Ellen also asked those questions first when something was wrong, understanding correctly that the body is where we keep our grief before we know how to say it. I thought about that later, lying in the condo at 2 a.m. I thought about how Ellen would have handled this. She would not have been angry. Ellen was not an angry woman. She would have been sad in that particular patient way of hers, a deep, quiet sadness that said, I see you clearly, and I am not leaving. I missed her so much in that moment that it had a physical location, somewhere directly behind my sternum, a specific weight. I had been trying to fill that weight for over a year with money and warmth and the sound of someone in the next room. You cannot fill it. That is the thing I finally understood. The weight does not fill. You simply learn to carry it better. The salon ran for 4 months. I visited twice. It was busy enough, I thought. There were customers. The staff looked competent. Stephanie seemed energized by it in those early weeks, talking about new services, a nail bar she wanted to add, a hotel relationship she was building. I listened with the warmth of a man who has invested in someone's dream and is watching it take root. Then in month 12, Stephanie came to me with a different expression, quieter, more careful. She said the salon was not going well. The rent was behind. A staff member had left and taken 3 regular clients. The hotel deal had not materialized. She needed to close it. I asked to see the accounts. She said there were no real accounts, that her cousin Rosario had been supposed to keep records but had not. The money was simply gone. All $55,000 of it dispersed into a category she called mismanagement and never returned to again. I felt something cold that day. It moved through me quickly, the way cold water moves through a room when a window opens in winter, and I shut it down. I told myself, businesses fail. I had seen it 100 times across 40 years of client work. What I did not examine, not carefully enough, was the timing. The salon had failed at the exact moment I had started, quietly and to myself, to ask questions. I did not examine that. I should have. Around this time, I noticed the phone. Stephanie's phone had started living face down on every surface. On the table at dinner, face down. On the kitchen counter, face down. On her side of the bed on the night she stayed at the condo, face down. I told myself it was a privacy preference, but I noticed it. And I noticed that it had not always been that way. In the early months, her phone sat screen up, buzzing with messages she would glance at and often show me, a funny photograph from Yvette, a voice note from Marilu. The phone had been open then. Now it was closed, and I was cataloging the change, the way accountants catalog everything, quietly and precisely and without yet knowing what it added up to. She started spending more nights at her mother's house in San Fernando. She said the children needed her there. She said Marilu's arthritis was worse. Both things were probably true. She said them in the tone of a woman who is telling the truth about one thing and using it to cover something else, and I heard that tone and I chose not to examine it. I was spending more time with Buck during those weeks, and Buck, to his credit, never once said I told you so. He asked how things were going. I told him fine, mostly. He said, mostly is a word that does a lot of work. I said I knew. He bought me another coffee and did not push it. I tried to bring it up with Stephanie directly, one evening when she had come to the condo for dinner and was already seeming to calculate when she could leave. I said, you are pulling away. I can feel it. She looked at me across the table with the expression of someone who has been caught doing something they have not yet decided to admit to, and then the expression changed to something gentler, something that was either genuine tiredness or a very good performance of it. I am tired, she said. I am just tired, Kenneth. That is all it is. I looked at her for a long time. She held my gaze. She did not look away, which I later understood was not evidence of honesty but evidence of practice. I believed her, or I chose to believe her, which is a different thing that feels identical from the inside. 2 weeks later, I asked about a call she had taken in the other room, a call that had lasted 20 minutes and after which she came back to the kitchen with her face arranged very carefully. I asked who it was. She said it was just a friend from before. I asked what that meant. She said it was someone she had known for a long time, nothing important, an old connection, not worth explaining. She said it lightly, dismissively. The way you describe something you have decided is not a topic. I let it go. I added it to the drawer in my mind with the other things I was not examining, and I closed the drawer again, and I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was an old man looking for problems in a good situation because I had been unhappy for so long, but I did not know how to accept something real. That was the story I was telling myself. I was very good at telling it. I had been practicing for months. Month 13, and I had been in Angeles City for over a year. My life in Michigan existed in a way that felt increasingly theoretical, a set of facts about a man I used to be. I knew the property management firm was handling the house. I knew my accounts were still in order, or had been in order, though I had stopped looking at the balances with my usual precision because the numbers were moving in a direction I was choosing not to confront directly. Carol called every 2 weeks and I gave her the managed version of things. David called once a month and asked if I needed anything, which was his way of saying he was thinking about me without quite knowing how to think about me. Stephanie came to me in month 13 with the house. She had found it through a cousin, a property in a neighborhood in San Fernando called Dolores, a clean residential area with a school nearby and a small market, and the kind of sidewalks where children played in the evening while their parents sat on plastic chairs outside and talked. The house was single-story, 3 bedrooms, a garden in the back. The family selling it were moving to Canada and needed a quick sale. The asking price was 4.2 million Philippine pesos. At the exchange rate in early 2022, that was approximately 82,000 US dollars. She did not call it a house she wanted to buy. She called it our house. She said, I found something. Something for us. She showed me the photographs on her phone, scrolling through them slowly while I looked, and she said things like, Yvette could have her own room, and the boys could play in the garden, and you would have somewhere real to come home to, not a condo, not a hotel, a real home. She looked at me with that particular expression, the one that made me feel like I was the solution to a problem she had been carrying alone for years, and I felt the familiar warmth of it, the warmth of being needed, of being capable, of being the man who could make the difficult thing not difficult anymore. I asked the question I had to ask. I asked whose name it would go in. She said hers, because foreigners could not own property in the Philippines, which was true. It is the law. I know the law. I had looked it up myself in the first month of being there, the kind of background research a former accountant does automatically. A house purchased in a Filipino woman's name with a foreign man's money belongs legally and entirely to that woman. I knew this. I told myself it did not matter because I trusted her. I told myself that the trust was the foundation, that the legal structure was just paperwork, that real commitments do not require the kind of protection you build when you do not trust the person you are committed to. I wired the $82,000. I told myself I was building a future. I was not building a future. The property transferred into Stephanie's name on a Tuesday in early March 2022. We had lunch afterward at a restaurant she chose, a place in San Fernando with ceiling fans and cold San Miguel and a view of the street. She held my hand across the table and said, "Thank you for all of it, for believing in something with me." I said there was nothing to thank me for. She said there was. She said it looking at the street, not at me, which I noticed and filed in the drawer that was getting full now, the drawer I was refusing to open. Those 3 days after Buck told me what he had seen were the quietest days I spent in Angeles City. I went for walks in the early mornings, when the streets were still mostly empty. I sat in the park by the river where I had been with Buck in my first week, and I watched the water and I thought about what I was holding. I was holding the knowledge that the woman I had funded to the tune of approximately $360,000 at that point was in a restaurant with a man she had been with for years, comfortable in the way that comes from choosing rather than needing. I held all of those things and let them arrange themselves into the shape they had been trying to form for months, the shape I had been refusing to look at. I went through it line by line, the way you go through a complex audit, without sentiment and without the desire to find a particular result, just looking for what was actually there. What was actually there was unambiguous. It had always been unambiguous. The call from Buck came 9 days after the property transfer. He asked if I was home. He said he had to tell me something, and he needed me to hear it before I decided how to feel about it. He said he had seen Stephanie the previous Tuesday evening at a restaurant in Dow. He had been there with his own friends, and he had seen her at a table by the window with a Filipino man, probably late 30s. They were sitting close together and talking the way people talk when they are very comfortable with each other, when the comfort is old rather than new. She was laughing. He said she looked happy in the way that people look happy when they are with someone they chose rather than someone they needed. I thanked him. He said, "Kenneth, I am sorry." I said I knew. He left. I sat at the kitchen table in the condo I was paying $900 a month for, and I thought about the phone face down on every surface, and the calls taken in other rooms, and the friend from before mentioned lightly like something not worth explaining, and I held all of those things and let them form the shape they had always been forming. On the third day I called her and asked her to come to the condo. She said she would come that evening. She arrived at 7 with a container of food she had brought, setting it on the counter with the habit of a woman who has been doing this for months, and I said, quietly, from the kitchen table where I was already sitting, "Sit down, Stephanie. I need to ask you something." She set the food down slowly. She did not turn around immediately. I watched her stand at the counter with her back to me for 3 or 4 seconds, and in those seconds I understood that she already knew what this conversation was, that she had been waiting for it the way people wait for things they have been postponing, with a kind of tired readiness. When she turned around and sat across from me at the table, her face was neutral, careful, not afraid. That neutrality told me more than anything she said in the next hour. I asked her about the man Buck had seen her with. I said his name, because Buck had found out his name for me. I said, "Who is Rodel Sanchez?" She did not flinch. She did not deny it, did not produce an elaborate alternative explanation, did not deploy tears as a shield. She said his name back at me simply, "Rodel Sanchez." She said they had been together for years. She said it had been complicated. She said she never meant for me to find out this way. She said all of this in the tone of someone who has been waiting to stop managing a situation and is experiencing something that might have been relief. I asked how long. She said since before we met. I said, so he was always there. She said yes. She said he was local, a mechanic from Pampanga, that they had been on and off for a long time, that it was not simple, that there were things about their history that she would not explain to me because some things were private. She said that last part firmly, without apology, and I thought, she is still protecting something that is not me. Even now, in this moment where everything is coming apart, she is still protecting him. I asked the question I should have asked a year ago, and the reason I had not asked it a year ago was that I had known, somewhere underneath everything, that the answer might be this. I asked, was any of it real? She looked at me for a long time, not unkindly. There was no cruelty in her face. There was something that looked like genuine conflict, like she was deciding how honest to be, and then she made the decision to be all the way honest, the way you sometimes do when the performance is finally over and the truth is the only thing left in the room. She said, "You were good to me, Kenneth. You were very good to me. My children have a better life because of you. Yvette is in the good school because of you. My mother does not worry about her medical bills anymore because of you. That is real. That did not come from nothing. I did care for you." She paused. "But I was never going to leave him." I sat with that sentence. I sat with it the way you sit with a piece of information that reconfigures everything around it, the way a single corrected entry in an audit can shift the meaning of every other number on the page. I was never going to leave him. It was not a confession of calculation. It was a statement of fact about herself, about who she had been the entire time, about where her actual life lived while she was being warmed to me. And the terrible thing about it was that I believed her. Not the betrayal part. I believed the care part. I believed that she had genuinely liked me, found real comfort in my steadiness, real pleasure in my company. I believed that she had held two things simultaneously without apparent difficulty: genuine warmth for me, and the knowledge that I was functional, that I was the man she needed until she did not need me anymore, and that those two things had coexisted in her without contradiction. I had been her insurance policy, and she had been, in her way, kind about it. I asked about the property. She said it was her house. She said it without aggression, just as a fact, because it was a fact. I asked about the money, all of it, the $445,000. She said she was sorry. She said it quietly, and I believe she meant it in the way that people mean it when they are sorry something happened, without being sorry they did it. I said I knew. I said it the way you say something when you have already processed it, when the saying of it is just the last step of a journey you finished in private. She left the food on the counter. That detail stays with me. She brought the food as a habit, as part of the performance of caring, and then the conversation happened, and the performance ended, and she left, but the food was still there, sitting on the counter in its container with the small post-it note she always wrote, saying what it was and how to reheat it, because she knew I sometimes forgot to check. She had written it before she came over. She had written it knowing what she was walking into, knowing that this was the conversation that was coming, and she had still written the post-it note and brought the food anyway. I have turned that over many times, and I have not been able to decide what it means, whether it was habit or kindness or a gesture toward something that had been real in whatever limited way it had been real. I ate the adobo eventually, around 11 that night, standing at the counter in a city where I had spent over a year of my life and $445,000. It was very good. She was an excellent cook. That is a strange thing to hold alongside everything else, but I hold it. She got up and took her bag and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "I hope you find something real, Kenneth. You deserve that." The door closed. I did not move for a long time. Then I called Carol. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, and when she answered, I said, "Carol, I need to tell you something." She heard it in my voice immediately. She said, "Dad, tell me." And I did. I told her all of it, the condo, the school fees, the salon, the property, the full number, every dollar of it. Carol cried. She did not say I knew it or why didn't you tell me or how could you. She said, "Are you okay?" I said I was. She said, "Are you coming home?" I said I did not know yet. She said, "Dad," just that, just my name. And it hit me somewhere below the ribs because it was the sound of someone who loves me without condition. I told her I would call again tomorrow. I sat alone in the condo for the rest of the night with the container of food still on the counter, and I did not eat until 11, and I did not sleep. And I thought about what it means to know something and choose not to know it, and how long a man can sustain that choice before the not knowing costs him everything. I spent 2 more weeks in Angeles City after that evening. I did not see Stephanie again. I did not try to. The house in San Fernando was hers, and we had both said everything that was going to be said, and the thing about that kind of ending is that it does not require a final scene. It requires only absence, and absence was something I had already learned to live inside. I had coffee with Buck 3 times during those final 2 weeks. We sat in the coffee shop run by the retired school teacher, the one with the calamansi juice, and we talked about things that were not Stephanie. We talked about his years in construction, about a bridge he had built in 1,998 inches Nevada that he was still proud of, about his 2 ex-wives who were both, as he put it, excellent women who deserved better than he had known how to give at the time. We talked about Michigan and what winter looked like, and whether I would miss the heat. He did not say, "I told you so." Not once, not in the direct way and not in the implied way either. He was simply present. He was the kind of decent that does not announce itself. On my second to last morning, he drove me past the property in San Fernando. I had not asked him to. He did it without explaining himself, and I looked at the house through the car window as we drove slowly past. It was a good house, a solid house. There was a garden in the back that I could see over the fence, and Yvette's school bag was hanging on a hook by the front door. Marco's bicycle was leaning against the wall. The house looked like what Stephanie had said it would look like, a home for her children, a stable place where a family lived and things were ordinary and safe. I thought about that for a moment. The money did something. It is not nothing that those children have that house. It is not nothing that Yvette is in the good school. Those things are real and they will keep being real after I am gone, and on my side of the ledger I have the grief of losing Ellen and the secondary grief of losing something I am still not sure was ever entirely mine to lose. I did not know what to do with that calculation. I left it there as we drove away. Buck dropped me at the departure gate at Clark Airport on a Tuesday morning in late December 2022. He shook my hand with both of his, the way men do when a handshake has to carry more than a handshake can reasonably hold. He said, "Come back when you are ready." I looked at him and I thought, I do not know if I will ever be ready in the way he means it. I said I did not know. He nodded. He let go of my hand. I picked up my bag and went through the departure doors. I landed in Detroit in the afternoon. Carol was at arrivals. She was wearing her winter coat, the blue one, and she looked like my daughter, which is a simple thing to say and a complicated thing to feel. The way the familiar can become temporarily extraordinary when you have been away from everything familiar for long enough. She did not ask questions at the gate. She hugged me and I stood there in the middle of Detroit arrivals with my carry-on bag and let her and thought, I have not been held by anyone who loves me without an agenda in over a year. That thought was more than I could manage cleanly, and I held it together anyway because there were too many people around and I had always held it together in public. She drove me to Michigan, to the house, to the maple tree that was now taller than the eaves. She made soup. She sat with me at the kitchen table while I ate it, and she did not interrogate me. She did not go back over the money or the decisions or the things I should have done differently. She simply sat there and refilled my bowl, and was my daughter in the way that matters, without condition. After dinner, she went to the guest room, which she had already prepared, which meant she had been planning to stay, which meant she had understood before I did that I was not going to be fine immediately. I told her I was grateful. She said, "Do not be." She said, "Good night." I sat alone in the kitchen. I cried that night. I want to say that clearly, because I did not cry when Ellen died, not in the way I should have, not in the full and proper way of a man who has lost the person he loved most in the world. I cried efficiently in those months, the way I did most things, brief and contained and back to function within the hour. That night in Michigan, I cried the way I should have cried in 2015. I cried for Ellen, for the 44 years and the maple tree and the way silence used to be company. I cried for the 6 years of carrying that loss in a locked drawer the way I had been carrying everything in locked drawers my entire adult life. And I cried for Angela City, for the version of myself I had been there, the version that paid for things instead of feeling them, the version that mistook being needed for being loved because he had forgotten what love actually felt like. It lasted about 20 minutes. Then it was over. I washed my face. I went to bed on my side of the bed. I did the math the next morning the way I always do the math, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad, writing the figures in my careful accountant's handwriting. The total was $445,000. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about what that number represents, not in the financial sense. I understand the financial sense perfectly well, but in the other sense, in the sense of what a man is willing to pay to stop feeling what he has been feeling, to replace one kind of emptiness with another kind that at least has a face and a name and says good morning. I want to end with something honest about what I know now that I did not know then, or that I knew but had not yet learned in the way that counts, in the body rather than just the mind. I know now that grief has a direction. It wants to go somewhere. If you do not give it somewhere to go, if you lock it in a drawer and keep functioning on top of it for 6 years, it will find its own somewhere. And the somewhere it finds will not be the somewhere you would have chosen. My grief for Ellen found Stephanie. It found the comfort of being needed in a country where I had no history of pain. It found the warmth of morning texts and brought food, and a 13-year-old girl who wanted to be a doctor. It found those things and it poured itself into them with a completeness that bypassed every professional instinct I had, because grief does not listen to professional instincts. Grief listens to the part of you that is simply human and simply wants. I was simply human, and I simply wanted to not be standing in that house in Michigan at 2 a.m. with a silence that had no name. That wanting cost me $445,000 and 14 months of a life I do not entirely regret having lived, because even the things that cost us everything teach us something we needed to know. What I needed to know was the shape of my own loneliness. I know it now. I can see it clearly, the way you can see the outline of a thing when you finally turn a light on in a dark room, and knowing the shape of it means I can stop running from it. I have told this story now. I have said all of it out loud. I am not telling it as a warning, though if it warns someone that is not the worst outcome. I am not telling it to indict Stephanie, who was a woman doing what she knew how to do in the circumstances she had, taking care of her children and her mother and the man she actually chose while also taking care of me in the way she could manage. I am telling it because I was a retired accountant who spent 40 years reading balance sheets, and I needed to read this one finally, clearly, with nothing omitted and no columns fudged in my own favor. The numbers say I spent $445,000 trying to outrun the grief of losing Ellen. The numbers say it did not work, but the numbers also say I am still here. I am 76 years old, and I am still here in this kitchen with the maple tree outside and my daughter in the guest room, and the soup she made last night still in the pot on the stove. I am still here, Ellen would have said. That is not nothing, Kenneth, she would have said. Start from there. I think I am going to try.